understanding on security. And I think, to my mind, how presently I see it, that beginning from insecurities, like currently I've been looking at everyday insecurities.
Take the battle to the world of ideas and say that let's create spaces, let's break the barrier there first.
I think we've covered a lot of distance in this podcast, in terms of, beginning from being the only woman in the room discussing security. And I think all of us who have ventured sometimes in this domain have found ourselves in that position where we were the only woman in that room. Hello, everyone. This is our inaugural edition of the podcast on many conversations around politics, around society, around culture. And I'm very happy to bring everyone to the first edition where we hope to build a conversation on women in security. Our guests for today's podcast are Professor Navnita Chadha Behera from the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi, and Dr. Shailza Singh from Department of Political Science, Bharati College, Delhi University, and myself, Rityusha Tiwary from the Department of Political Science, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College. We are hoping to have a conversation with everyone here in terms of bringing in the idea of women in security, both visible as well as invisible aspects. And in that sense, it's also important to open up this issue in terms of how we see women overall in politics, overall on issues that relate to politics and society, politics and security. And in this, perhaps the best guests that we could get for this conversation are these two who are joining us today. Professor Navnita Behera Chadha, I am indeed delighted to welcome you to our podcast. And I just hope that through this conversation, we are opening up more discourses, more ideas, and more initiatives where visibilization of women is actually brought in, and we focus on mainstreaming gender. Because many a times we just correlate these categories and just compensate one category with another when we are using women and gender. So, and I'm also very happy to just tell everyone who's not able to see our crew that we have men as allies and as solidarity partners who are building this podcast. So how do you look at this whole idea of women in security? What are certain dimensions which you think are, as it were, the opening acts when we start a dialogue on women in security? Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rityusha. First of all, congratulations for this new initiative of your college, first in the series. So I think this is a special privilege. Thank you. Much appreciated. And of course, looking forward to have a conversation with you, Shailza. Okay, so when we look at the issue of women in security, you can start the conversation by looking at the practitioners. And if you were to look at practitioners, you can look at different foreign officers, you can look at the military, you can look at armed forces, and armed forces personnel even going abroad. Earlier in our conversation, we were mentioning about peacekeeping forces. I'm reminded of an anecdotal conversation. Many years ago, I was interviewing one of the first women diplomats in Bangladesh Foreign Office. And the most interesting thing she told me was that when she joined the Foreign Office, she was the first woman, and she realized that the arrangements, the way the whole office was structured, there was a inbuilt assumption that there will never be any woman coming into those setups. So the invisibilization takes place just in terms of a spatial imagination. The spaces are organized in a way that the expectation is there, this is like a male space. And it's not just the ceiling that you break in terms of entering those spaces. I think the more interesting part is when they start occupying positions in decision making, the foreign service officers, not just the clerical staff, which is generally the assumption that is there. But I think on that score, I would say there has been a lot of progress. There is a rare foreign office around the world where I would find that women diplomats are uh, almost not on equal fronts with men. They have their strengths to which they play admirably well. There are several situations where they still get typecast as being given the so-called soft roles, in the diplomatic networks. But I think a lot of barriers are being broken there. I'm still reminded in my classroom setting, the first book that we read was the Cynthia and Low Banana Bitches and Bases. That sort of used to be a very handy book in sort of turning the lens completely around. So you're wanting to understand a high politics domain of superpower rivalry, US military bases in Philippines, and you're wanting to understand it from the point of view of the women prostitutes who are serving the base, and because of which the base acquires a certain longevity. So it's far away from the diplomatic high table, and yet Enloe shows it as to how effective it is to understand the politics that US was playing in the whole Southeast Asian region. So I think whether you look at the foreign policy practitioners, we can identify certain areas, and I'm sure we'll come up in the conversation as to what specific areas that we wish to focus on, whether it is to do with the military conflicts domain, whether it's the nuclear policy making. I still remember the conversation where the US Madeleine Albright was asked whether she would have the gumption to press the nuclear button. For the conversation was about whether US would have a first woman president or not. And that was the proverbial question that was thrown, at that end. And the military is a different institution altogether, and there it's been a tougher battle. I think in Indian context only, we've had recent Supreme Court judgments where the judiciary has had to step in to tell armed forces that women senior corps officers need to be accorded the same rights in terms of their promotion, in terms of their service duties, in terms of the roles that they are assigned to. So it's kind of breaking barriers from that conventional roles, which is typically in medical corps. And they are, sort of flying the fighter jets now, and they are at the forefront. So there is a material change that we witness, or we are beginning to witness, but there is still a long way to go. And I think we'll probably come back to that part of the conversation and where the gaps still remain. It's good to start perhaps with a note of where we can sort of something to look forward to, where we can counter, sort of successes. So I think I'll pass on the mic to Dr. Shailja.
Thank you, Professor Behera, and I would begin by saying that many congratulations to Rityusha for this wonderful initiative, and looking forward to many more such dialogues, and I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this dialogue and here conversing with you and Professor Behera. And yes, I agree with you, Professor Behera, that you brought some very pertinent points to the fore, that there is certainly breaking of barriers in the traditional understanding of security, and we see more women being brought into performing the roles which were earlier close to them. They were not open, they were not simply their roles to be played in the traditional sense of the term, and so those breaking of the barriers is certainly more important, and we see that the very fact that more women are now there performing those roles, certainly brick by brick would be leading to greater changes. And but yes, I would say that the UN WPS, the World Women, Peace and Security Initiative, which tries to come up with, which has come with a new idea called gender responsive leadership. So not only at the force level, but at the leadership level, where the more important decisions are being made, how those decisions are gender responsive and perspectives of women, more to say, not just replica of the traditional roles what security has been traditionally understood, but how these the welcoming of more women force into these areas leads to a different perspective, different imaginary of the space, and the concept and the idea is something which is very welcome. And but still, yes, as Professor Behera pointed out, that there is a long way to go, and in fact the UN studies and researches and reports also talk about that how far they have come and what more roadblocks exist. So one of the facts is that merely by bringing in more women, which the percentage still remains very low. I remember reading one of the recent reports of the UN studies on women, peace and security, and it is in some areas that how the security forces have only about 6.6 percentage of women, which is a very low number for any bigger change to be imagined. But yes, there is nonetheless movement forward, and whether it is in the military, whether in the foreign services, or even in the within the country, the security, the police forces, we see more women coming in, and with them newer horizons being explored as to how that can invest into the meaning of how we understand security and what security the content can be created and explored further. So I think we'll be discussing some of these in the context of the wider framework on how security has been traditionally understood and what are the critical engagements with that. And so I think, yeah, we'll be coming back to those. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for those opening remarks, both of you. And in fact, as you were speaking, I was reminded of a lot of things that we have to discuss in this edition. But yes, just to kind of make haste, because we have this as 40 minutes thing, I would like to actually bring in something, as you pointed out, the materiality of it. Yes, there is a substantive change when we look at women in security, the visible aspect of security, and the way, the dedicated manner in which the World Organization, they are institutionally supporting the idea of making women more visible. So yes, there is a push in terms of what we see materially out there, and therefore definitely it's coming from certain ideational base, which opens up this whole idea that yes, women are needed out there. But do you think that there are pertinent gaps here? Because even if you look at the material aspect of visible securitization, as it were, and as Shailja pointed out, that 6% of women are there on an average in military forces. There is a substantive gap. We already know this, but even at the level of ideas, and I'm reminded by that entire understanding that we'll bring our women folk out when there are women folk out there in the opposition to fight us. Unless that is there, we don't really need women in our security forces. And that's the kind of understanding we've been looking at in terms of academia when we do IR and security. And there've been this I'm reminded by one American scholar, I'm reminded of him when he said that, oh, but we are fighting the men in foreign policy, so we can't really feminize our foreign policy. The American foreign policy was the context in which this argument was made. And I think this argument resonates all across the world. So even when we look at our own Indian armed forces, the percentage of women is not all that high. So is it just about certain gaps in the material base that is visible right now, or is it also that we haven't really reached that space in terms of even ideas, where we start looking at women as not just receivers of insecurity, because there is this whole thing which we need to talk about. Who is this object of security? Who is the subject of security? And is there also a process of, othering, where we bring in the binaries of security, insecurity, and, the females become the ones who have to be saved in this whole scenario of war. And that's what the men folk do, right? So even at the level of ideas, I see gaps there. What do you have to say about that?
I think there is no doubt about it. There is a integral sort of I would say even a dialectical relationship between the materiality and the ideational basis, because when senior women officers join foreign policy establishments, the first thing that oral testimonies with several of them would show you is that they they feel they have to prove themselves, and in order to prove themselves, they sometimes take even more masculine, even more militaristic stand, show as to show. Like you remember Mrs. Gandhi's best version was like compared to Durga, right? And even when there was a point of time, I remember when we've had two women prime ministers in the subcontinent. There was Radhika Kumaraswamy in Sri Lanka. There was Sheikh Hasina, and followed by what was her name, Khalida Zia. But in both the cases, we felt that it was not necessary. And there was, of course, Benazir Bhutto, the third one at that point of time. So it was not the case that suddenly South Asia was at peace, or there were no conflicts, and there are distinct conversations that both Radhika and Benazir Bhutto herself took, and where they explained that when the military is breathing down your neck, you sometimes have to stand up and be counted. And I remember I experienced it myself once as a young sort of a scholar. I was once accosted in a room full of about 21 Pakistani military generals. I was the only woman in the room, and only among three other Indian nationals, there were two other scholars from Aligarh Muslim University, and they're just like going hammer and tongs. So finally I told them, I said, just tell me, do you want to just listen to an Indian national trying to defend my position, or do you want to listen to Navnita, what she has to say? Because unless you allow that freedom to articulate what you really feel, the ideational spaces are not there. And this is what a lot of senior women leaders also feel in that position. They feel somehow that they're being put in a position to defend themselves. And it's only when they break through that barrier that they're actually able to make a difference. And it's not that they haven't done it. There are examples that you will find, all across, not just South Asia. I would even say in the larger context of the third world, or the what we call now global South. You find very, very powerful examples where they have been able to ideationally actually break the mold, so they say, and take a conversation in a new trajectory. I mean, I'm reminded of like the recent Russia-Ukraine war that is taking place. Now, the general tenor of the conversation is that the global South has not been so forthcoming, to defend this rules violation of the rules-based world order. And one of the best interviews I heard was, I think it's probably an ambassador from Nigeria, or somebody was giving an interview to a US think tank. And she said, as simply as that, she said, you remember the rules-based order when Russia or somebody else is violating it. What happens when you violate the rules-based order? And she gave example of Palestine, she gave example of Iraq, she gave example of Afghanistan, when this coalition of willing went in without the UN Security Council sanctions. She says, like, wasn't that a violation of rule? Why a selectivity? Now, for her to be able to articulate that point as simply and I think as effectively as she could, I was like, that's the way to go, because you're able to really break the mold there and take the conversation in a way that forces you to think that yes, there is something different happening here. So it doesn't happen perhaps often enough, and that's because there are structural constraints, and one has to understand what the structural constraints are. I mean, even larger number of global South countries, we are so caught up in our narratives of having to defend our sovereignty, that realist way of thinking, which is very state-centric, power politics paradigm, it just kind of fixes you in a traditional framework. and then it's a challenge first to break that and then bring a new thinking in. So there are a lot of structural constraints that I think women practitioners still face, and I think it's a task of us social scientists that we create that ground where we make it possible, we create a level playing field, at least in the domain of ideas, so that it becomes, their task becomes a wee bit easier. Once the level playing field in the domain of ideas is there, perhaps they can find it easier to start implementing some of those ideas. But there is a lot more ground, so I'm sure Dr. Shailja, I would look to you to cover many other aspects.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Behera. Very important point that you raised about ideational opening up, and which is a challenge actually, because this is what we can call women are operating from a position of what we can coin a term called multiple marginality. So the initial challenge is to sort of prove, as Professor Behra said, to the expected role of a leader, of a security personnel, of somebody who's in charge of providing security and protection, as it has been understood in the masculinist and the state-centric understanding of security. So initially the thing is that women there have this challenge of proving themselves in the sense that she's not a better officer, she's not a good foreign officer or a security provider or a protector. So there is a certain understanding of how a protector is supposed to perform, and which is where the women are initially sort of proving. And then when the space opens up, then maybe there are different leadership styles. As ma'am said, there are not many of those, but yes, there are those where uh, uh, women in those roles are able to find that space and scope to actually present how they see the situation, express or articulate how the situation is supposed to be handled. And they have done so in the past. Some of the examples Professor Behra herself gave. Not so much because, yes, the structural constraints and pressures are looming large, and which is where I totally agree, Professor Behra, that the role of academics and the intelligentsia comes forth, where we have to create that awareness, that consciousness, that understanding, open up that conceptual and ideational space where we see that what security means, how security should be done, and what are the silences within the understanding of security itself. So there are silences, and there are so security and insecurity. When we see them together, how do we look at insecurity from multiple vantage points? Unless that is brought into the picture, we don't see only bringing, as I said earlier, also bringing more women in, minus this opening up of ideational space, or what Professor Behra said, that level playing field, or even more opening them up more as to what does security look like, or maybe what is insecurity, to begin from what is insecurity for me when I sign up for the idea of security as a woman, or as somebody who belongs to the global south, or as somebody who belongs to whose location is from that multiple margins. So unless we open up the security discourse itself, merely by having more women in the workforce is not going to actually produce a drastic result or outcome, I would say. So yeah.
Bringing back your point of multiple marginalities, I think it's very important that we look at security from the perspective of who are we really actually talking about, and can everyone claim security for themselves wherever they are positioned. So bringing in the idea of multiple marginalities, multiple positionalities, as it were, when we start dissecting, deconstructing security slash insecurity paradigm, it's extremely important. And as you pointed out, in the very idea of mainstreaming, women, or bringing more women, representing more women in a particular kind of domain, be it security or politics or leadership roles or in governance at large, it won't really suffice, because it also needs to take care of the idea that women may not be really fitting that particular kind of popular imagery of leadership. And they may have their own version to offer, which perhaps is not really just falling back into this whole question of whether men are better or women are better. It's simply bringing the idea that there are differences, and these differences may just manifest themselves in a very different manner altogether. So there's no fixed way of looking at leadership, right? So, and in that sense, one of the popular imageries that we see of leaders around the world, and is that a leader is supposed to look a certain way. And if it's a female leader, again, a very, very typecast role is basically allocated to them. If I look at the example from Global South, for instance, the women would mostly be representing their, national attire or cultural, representation of how a particular woman leader is supposed to look at, whereas males would be more or less similar across the world. So there is this particular subjectivity that the female leaders have for themselves, they have constructed. I do remember there was an instant where foreign minister who was a female, she refused to attend a particular, function in one of the foreign lands, because simply for the fact that her national attire wasn't there, it just didn't reach in time. So she would rather not represent the nation without the national attire, and she just, just opted out of that event, even though she was there in that city. So it's to that extent that we fall into the idea of role playing when we are representing ourselves, our understandings, but we are also representing what we understand as the demands of the nation, as it were. So, how do you see the popular culture, for instance, opening up this idea that yes, women can be different? Because if you look at social media, if you look at the misinformation that is spread about women who are in very powerful position, or who are maybe competing for those powerful positions, and they may become very strong stakeholders when it comes to decision making about issues which surround security, we see the spread of misinformation very high for them vis-a-vis their male counterparts. So do you see certain countercurrents? Do you see that, for instance, there's this feminist foreign policy, the term feminist foreign policy is also kind of coming up. So how do you see the popular space opening up for a different role, or a different version, or a different image of women leaders?
I think social media is a very amorphous kind of a space, and can be very hostile too, and can be very powerful tool to also carry your message far and wide. I'm reminded of two very different examples. For example, this was the Prime Minister of New Zealand and Prime Minister of, was it Finland? A woman Prime Minister? When she went partying, and she was trolled like no one's business. And, she was simply like, I mean, I am a prime minister, yes, but I'm a human too. I'm a woman too. I'm entitled to have my fun. And the New Zealand prime minister, same thing. There's like, just because you are a woman prime minister, it does not mean that you will be held to differential standards. And they defied it, and they sort of send the message loud and clear that I will play the game on my terms. That, I am fulfilling all the duties that are expected of me as a prime minister of the country, but I cannot, I refuse to give rights over my own personal space and my personal life, just because social media decides to sort of catch on to a particular image. Now, these are kind of couple of negative examples where, the popular imagery, you are expected to uphold a differential standard, so to say. And yet it's an example where both of them manage to break the expected mold and say that no, we will play to our own tune, so to say. But I think increasingly what is happening is that there is a growing realization that it's ultimately what you stand for. It's what are the values that you're bringing into play? How are you differently conceiving the world? How are you reaching out to other countries? I mean, in African countries, much behind the scenes, what I find is, like, whether it was the role of OAU and others, there are several women leaders that perhaps to the world stage we don't get to know. But if you were to speak to closely, have a conversation with scholars working in that area, they would tell you that they are very effective. And they have learned how to use, to some extent, social media to their advantage. So it's like, it's a game that is still unfolding. I would still say in the domain of popular culture. And it's not just the leaders in powerful positions, in security positions. I mean, the most recent example that comes to my mind is one of our national icons, Deepika Padukone. When she was representing India at Oscars. Now, that representation should speak for itself, but attention is going more towards her attire. The expectation was that, what is she wearing? Why is she not wearing an Indian national attire? And she was like, she's carrying off. Again, it's a question of how she introduced the song that was in contention for an Oscar award, the values that she highlighted in her introduction. It's the idea that you are bringing to play that counts. Now, it's our choice, so to say, whether you wish to focus more energy on the attire or whether you wish to focus more energy on the values that women stand for. I think gradually the needle is going to shift in the second direction. It may take time, but I think we are going to get there. I'm optimistic.
Okay, get together. Yeah, I think on the question of the media and their attitude towards women in public roles, I think the effort here is to actually reinforce the societal expectation of women sort of balancing their traditional roles and being in public place, being the ideal traditional person in the public role as well. So I think that demand of the society being, sort of media catering to that demand, I think that is the main cause of, where a woman's attire and what she said or what is she doing in her personal life comes more before her public role, or what decisions did she take and what kind of a leader she is. I think these questions become secondary, and her dress, her personal time, and all of that comes to the fore. So I think that also goes back to the point that how women, with their later entry into their public roles, have to struggle with that challenge as well. So I think the cause of it is that traditional versus bringing their role into the public domain. So the public entry of women is not something which is very happily and accepted as they are, and women have to face it for some time. And but I would say, because they already know that this will come to them, that how good they are in their traditional roles, and then how they are there in their public roles. I think in some cases, and in, like, which Professor Behera also pointed out, they've been able to manage them better than any other leaders, I would say. So I think that's an advantage that women have, because they've been doing this balancing act for a very long time, and therefore they are actually the winners of this handling of social media, as we would say.
Skill sets are very different.
Skill sets are very different. Yes, and they are very, very good, I would say. So yeah. So I think media can be an advantage for when it comes to women in public role, because given the fact that that hostility would come to them, and they are managing it quite well. So yes.
Thank you. And that brings me to our last question. Where do we exactly go from here? From bringing in more women to areas where these things are discussed, these things are dwelt upon, decisions are taken, important frameworks of security are envisaged and then practiced upon. From doing that initial step, and then of course along the way we have been able to identify the gaps that still exist both in the structure, the material as well as ideational, and as we discussed in the last segment, this requirement of a certain kind of performativity that Judith Butler speaks about, this requirement of performativity of an ideal leader, ideal decision maker, ideal actor, ideal object, ideal subject, from altering that entire discourse. Where do we see today this whole effort of gendering the security discourse? Where is it now? If we were about to take a stock of the situation, and where do we go from here? Maybe Shailaja, yeah, this time.
Yeah, okay. So, thank you for that very important question, because I think that is one of the most important questions, that where do we go from here? And we are already on our way. What we need to, I think, when it comes to security, I think that critical engagement with the conventional, the traditional way of looking at security, I think that is very important. And as academicians, I think that is our responsibility as well, to look at critically look at what security has been meaning so far, and what are the silences in the discourse on security and the understanding on security. And I think, to my mind, how presently I see it, that beginning from insecurities, like currently I've been looking at everyday insecurities, because women, and particularly when we look at gendering security, I think gender responsiveness is not just talking about women. It's about the expected roles of people, whether they are men, women, and all minority genders. We can, of course, we have to create a space for that, and interrogate that what are the insecurities, real insecurities, for which the signing up of idea of security, which has a the whole idea of international relations is based on that foundational principle of security, and citizens and people sign up for the idea of security, because there is an appeal, there is a resonance among people, security. But is that what the state-centric understanding of security is? Is it my idea of security? What are my insecurities? So the concept of, say, everyday insecurities, which is a lot of feminist scholars have been looking at it, because violence, the inherent violence in the everyday that women have to undergo, that doesn't really figure in the dominant understanding of security. So the question of Cynthia and Loy, where are the women? And then she starts looking at that, where are women located, and what are their insecurities? So I think such questions need to be brought to the fore, and the spectrum of understanding of security needs to be widened, and more issues need to be brought in from multiple vantage points, and more inclusivity has to be looked at when we think about security. The very concept of security needs opening up, and from there we can proceed to probably a better world, and a more a world which is characterized by more security in the true sense, and more well-being in the true sense. I have to say that I think Professor Behera would add much more depth and meaning to what I was not able to sort of
No,
say
no, no.
in
I
those
think
my words.
I think you've covered a lot of ground there. In fact, it's little for me to add is that, look, we can perhaps begin to understand the issue from our own positionalities, right? As academics, as all three of us are. One way to do is to, you need to sensitize the generation that we come. We all engage with college going, university going generations, and if we can sensitize that generation to come to understand that the security does not necessarily mean the state security. And there are discourses, there's a very popular discourse now on human security too, but when you kind of interrogate the discourse on human security, you find that that again, engendered at the hands of World Bank, IMF, so it talks in terms of withdrawal of the state, but with literalizing that the withdrawal of the state in many countries in the global south actually means more insecurity for the woman, more insecurity for those who are on the margins of the society as it is. So I think as academics, our responsibility, I take it as that at least discursive level we need to make those interventions. At a training level we need to sensitize in terms of generations to come, and in terms of building solidarities and synergies with practitioners, we need to open up those spaces of debates where they feel then empowered to actually execute things. Our strength is domain of ideas, their strength is domain of action. The two needs to tango together, the way I see it. So we are all navigating the same spaces from different vantage points, and to the extent we can be support to each other, to the extent that we can develop these synergies, I think that is the way to look forward to. And then there are, what Dr. Shailja was saying earlier, in terms of multiple marginalities, there are actually multiple sources of strength. If you look at the way social movements have built solidarities across borders, the way we talk about non-state actors, and as students, they talk about multinational companies. I often tell them, look at all these climate change sort of advocates, environmental groups, sensitization of that, water sharing, human trafficking. There are several of those migration related crises. If you remember the case of those two girls who the Syrian refugees, one of them kind of swam for the refugees and won an Olympic, and her sister is facing a prison sentence for helping other migrants. So you need to build solidarities, and that's where women in power can also actually help. I find women in positions of power, even if you still have to speak up for your nation, but there is so much you can do on the margins to empower these voices, to empower these networks, to empower these solidarities, and it's a mutual win-win situation. It's a mutually supportive processes. But I think as academics, I always agree that our domain is to sort of take the battle to the world of ideas and say that let's create spaces, let's break the barrier there first, whether it's in terms of understanding the concept of security. I mean, when we were talking about human security, a lot of people talk about citizens, right? But then and every political scientist would agree that women as citizen rights are different sometimes from men's rights as citizens. But to problematize that and link it to the question of security, that's something that sort of still needs to happen. At the Bangladesh's, this anniversary that they're having, the stories of the Viranganas are now coming out, where, they fought for the independence of their country. They got stigmatized because of the systematic rape policy of the Pakistan army. And Bangladesh trying to sort of glorify them by giving them the label of Virangana actually became a cause of stigma. And yet the same women are now coming out today and saying that yes, we were the Viranganas, that we no longer have that shame attached to that whole phenomenon. So that breaking out of the silences, I think that should give a lot of courage to those who are still sort of struggling on the margins and still looking for spaces where they can make those effective interventions. So more power to them.
More power to everyone, of course, in that sense, wherever efforts are involved, basically, in terms of opening up the spaces for more and more voices, more and more agencies to nurture, to come out and act upon. I think we've covered a lot of distance in this podcast, in terms of, beginning from being the only woman in the room discussing security. And I think all of us who have ventured sometimes in this domain have found ourselves in that position where we were the only woman in that room, to moving away from that kind of understanding, where it's not just enough to identify oneself as a woman, but also oneself as an individual who perhaps can have multiple solidarities, as you were pointing out. So querying the space, as both the speakers pointed out, probably that's also one way of opening up the discourse, and a very, very important one at that. And I think we have a long distance to go, but we are already there. And this podcast is just a tiny bit drop into that ocean of effort that we still need. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in for this one. And we invite everyone to go for our subscription, as well as look up our channel on YouTube. And we are going to be back with the second edition soon. Thank you, everyone.